Ladies and gentlemen, it is an honor for me to chair the third session of this conference, in which we will have the guest lecture from Professor Daniel Schroeter. Before the lecture, I would like to thank Professor Batzion Kluman-Eraki for her initiative to create the Center for Studies of Relations of Jews, Christians, and Muslims. During her leadership, the center became an important and a leading center in Israel in these topics. So thank you, Batzion, for your work. I would like also to congratulate Professor Kabha, the new director of the center. Our guest, Professor Daniel Schroeter, from the Department of History in the University of Minnesota, is the author of the numerous books and articles on the history of Morocco and the Jews of Islamic world. I will mention only a few of his works, mainly his books: The Sultan's Jews, Morocco and the Sephardi World, Jewish Culture and Society in North Africa, in which he was co-editor with Emily Gutrich, and Merchant of Essaouira, Urban Society and Imperialism in Southern Morocco, 1844-1886. He was a visiting professor at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, and he works there on the subject of the position of the Jewish communities in the French and the Spanish protectorates of Morocco during World War II, after the establishment of Vichy regime. Professor Schroeter is a friend, is a colleague, and is a very distinguished researcher regarding those topics. And I want to thank you, Professor Schroeter, for coming to our conference. The title of the conference will be Jews, Muslims, and Colonialism, Shifting Power Relation in North Africa under Vichy rule during World War II. Professor Schroeter, please.
Toda rabba, Chaim. And I apologize for the English. No, your English was fine. But I also want to take this opportunity to thank the Open University and Batzion for the invitation to speak, and also to this very interesting Center for the Study of Relations between Muslims, Christians, and Jews, which I'm learning about, and it's great work that you're doing. So I feel very honored to be here to give this talk. So Operation Torch, which was the invasion of Morocco and Algeria by the Allied forces in November of 1942, brought hope to the Jews that the discrimination they had endured under Vichy would quickly end. The American command, however, reached agreement with Vichy's commander-in-chief, the Admiral Darlan, ensuring a quick end to hostilities in Morocco and Algeria. The Jews' hope for a quick turnaround were dashed. The American military command sought the cooperation of the French colonial authorities, who had been servants of the Vichy government, to stabilize their control as the battle for Tunisia was raging. French officials claimed that repealing the anti-Semitic legislation would jeopardize their ability to maintain control over the Muslim population, a concern which also influenced the American commanders. Local Jewish leaders and protests from Jewish organizations and government officials, especially in Britain and the US, put pressure on the French colonial administration. In March 1943, 4 months after the Allied invasion, General Henri Giraud, the French High Commissioner in North Africa, who had replaced Darlan after the latter's assassination on Christmas Eve of 1942, reluctantly repealed the anti-Jewish laws. Yet as part of the same measure, he also abrogated the Crémieux Decree of 1870, which was the law that had granted citizenship to Algerian Jews. And he did this with the justification that it had eliminated racial discrimination, since Muslims had been excluded from the law which granted Jews citizenship rights. Presumably, from a legal point of view, Giraud deemed it necessary to repeal the law for a second time, because in fact, the law was first abrogated in 1940, at the time that the Vichy government had promulgated the anti-Jewish laws. So the second time it was repealed, the Jews regarded it as an outrage and an anti-Semitic act. It was not until late 1943, when the Free French forces were in control and when most of the old Vichy regime had been routed out, that the Crémieux Decree was reinstated. The double abrogation of the Crémieux Decree and its restitution emblemized the shifting power relations in colonial North Africa during World War II. Most scholars agree that World War II and the Vichy period in particular brought a shift in the relationship between Muslims, Jews, and the French colonial rulers. This has been interpreted in a number of ways. One interpretation points to the impact of the betrayal of France and its ideals. Jews had seen France as their protectors, but the Vichy regime, supported by masses of European Christian settlers, caused profound disillusionment. Concerned about the colonial future and the prospects of living again under Muslim rules, Jews increasingly turned to Zionism or emigration as a solution to their dilemma. Others have placed great emphasis on the betrayal of Muslims. During the Third Reich, Muslim nationalists turned to Germany and the Nazis for support against the common enemy, the French and the British. While a few Muslim leaders denounced Vichy's anti-Jewish policies and the abrogation of the Crémieux Decree, most were probably indifferent or even welcomed the demotion of the Jews. And while the Moroccan Sultan Sidi Mohammed ben Yusuf, later known as Mohammed V, declared that he would protect his Jewish subjects, as some have argued, he was powerless to defy the French authorities by defending the Jews. His protection of the Jews, therefore, is a myth. The double failure of both France and Muslims to protect the Jews has shaped the narrative on the experience of Vichy in the war years. This seems to resonate ever so more powerfully in today's political climate, that Muslims and Jews are separated by irreconcilable differences, and this is particularly manifested in France today, where the Republic has failed to defend the Jews from its large and increasingly anti-Semitic Muslim population. I would like to propose a somewhat different framework for analyzing the impact of World War II on Muslim-Jewish relations and the relationship of both communities to the colonial authorities. The fall of France and the establishment of the Vichy government blatantly exposed the racism and discriminatory hierarchies upon which the colonial system rested. Although the anti-Jewish legislation enacted in Algeria, Tunisia, and Morocco was an integral part of the larger Nazi-inspired and Vichy-instigated statute for the Jews of metropolitan France, its application in French North Africa was closely connected to colonial policy and the hierarchical relationship with Muslims, Jews, and the European Christian settler communities. As in metropolitan France, the anti-Jewish laws removed Jews from a wide range of professions, public offices. It imposed the numerus clausus on students in schools and expropriated Jewish-owned businesses and enterprises designed to Aryanize the Jewish economy. In the colonial setting, not only were these laws intended to satisfy the European settlers, who were, for the most part, more enthusiastic for Vichy's national revolution, as it was called, than were the population in the French mainland, but also to appease the Muslim population by exploiting their perceived resentment towards the Jews' advancement and close association to colonial power. The French hoped that demoting the Jews' status would stem the growth of the anti-colonial nationalists, who had since the beginning of the Third Reich turned increasingly to Germany for support of their anti-colonial movements, and who joined common cause with the Nazis in denouncing a France, as they saw it, governed by Jews. Even after the Vichy government was in control, the French still feared the continued support of Germany to the anti-French nationalists. The Crémieux Decree of 1870 granted the indigenous Jews of Algeria French citizenship en masse, with the exception of the Jews of the Saharan region of Mzab, which had not been annexed to the Algerian colony until 1882. Significantly, Algerian Muslims were not granted this status, except for a few individuals, and remained indigenous subjects of the French Empire without political rights of citizenship, despite the fact that Algeria had been divided into provinces and annexed to France. Vociferous opposition to the Crémieux Decree was mounted by the European settlers, the so-called Pieds Noirs, soon after its promulgation. In the years that followed, the European settler community was responsible for some of the worst manifestations of anti-Semitism, especially during the height of the Dreyfus Affair. The Crémieux Decree remained like a festering wound among the European Pieds Noirs community, and to this day is part of the collective consciousness of many in France, a symbol of the far right, of all that is wrong with the Republic. While political leaders in metropolitan France saw the advantage of increasing the number of loyal French citizens by enfranchising the Jews, many in the colonial lobby had misgivings about the Crémieux Decree and regarded it as a miscalculation, or worse, a grave error. Though an axiom of colonialism to promote a minority over the majority population according to the principle of divide and rule, this was outweighed by resentment towards the ascendancy of the Jews, which had disrupted the racial hierarchy and the privileged position of the European settler community. Reaction of the Muslim population to the Crémieux Decree was negligible. Despite the indifference or muted opposition of Muslims, the risk of inflaming Muslim sentiment or resentment to colonial rule because of privileging native Jews over Muslims became the principal justification for not granting collective French citizenship to Jews in the French protectorates of Tunisia, established in 1881, and in Morocco, which was a protectorate established in 1912. Jews remained in the majority indigenous subjects of the Tunisian, Beylico, and Moroccan Sharifian governments, respectively, despite concerted efforts by the westernized elites and the Alliance Israélite Universelle advocating for extending French citizenship to the Jews in the protectorates. The policy was justified by the ideology of preserving indigenous structures and not to agitate the Muslim population by elevating Jews above them. But more important to the colonial thinking was preserving European settler privilege. Compared to Algeria, Tunisia and Morocco had much smaller proportions of French settlers, and therefore a sort of Crémieux Decree for the protectorates was out of the question. The French colonial government feared that Jews would inundate the European settler community, challenge European privilege, and ignite anti-Semitism. It was deemed sufficient to allow a limited number of Jews access to the modern colonial sector to serve as intermediaries, while blocking the vast majority of indigenous Jews from European society. Nevertheless, Jewish advancement for many of the European settlers had still gone too far in the protectorates. In Morocco, the number of indigenous Jews acquiring French citizenship remained small and restricted, but their access to the modern European sector was accelerating, and in numbers disproportionate to the Muslim population, especially facilitated by the modern education provided by the Alliance Israélite Universelle, especially those involved in foreign trade. Morocco also was a marketplace for foreign nationalities. Furthermore, there were hundreds of Algerian Jews, as they were called, of the modern elite in Morocco who held French citizenship. Many, in fact, were of Moroccan origin, who acquired French nationality in Algeria. Indeed, Moroccan and Algerian identities were porous, especially for Jews living in the bordering regions of western Algeria and eastern Morocco, where Jews often migrated back and forth between Oujda and the region and the province of Oran. Therefore, the promulgation of the Crémieux Decree and its abrogation during the war reverberated across North Africa. In Algeria, Muslim elites were pressing for and had already obtained expanded political rights. Yet most Muslims remained, unlike Jews, indigenous subjects rather than full citizens of France. The Deinard law of 1919 had expanded some political rights to eligible Algerian Muslims and also allowed their naturalization without requiring them to relinquish their personal status, the prerequisite of individual naturalization of indigenous Muslims and Jews, according to the Senatus Consult of 1865, which had remained in effect for Muslims. Politicians in France debated the question of whether Muslims might be made French citizens with political rights, a kind of extension of the Crémieux Decree, to all Algerian subjects. But most of the European settlers, fearing the loss of their privileged position, were adamant in their opposition to any such proposal and effectively blocked most bills that would have increased the political rights of Algerian Muslims, such as the Blum-Violet Bill of 1936 that would have extended citizenship to 25,000 Algerians. The various proposals and negotiations over Muslim citizenship in the 1930s raised the specter of the Crémieux Decree and the inferior status of Muslims over native Jews that the decree had come to represent. The repeal of the Crémieux Decree was a devastating psychological blow for Algerian Jews whose loyalty to France and the principles of the French Republic had become a foundation to their identity. In reality, the stripping of their citizenship had little practical consequences, since all Jews were subject to the same anti-Semitic laws regardless of their nationality. On a symbolic level, however, it was much more important, its ramifications stretching beyond the boundaries of Algeria to the protectorates. In Morocco, in particular, the abrogation of the Crémieux Decree raised questions about how to define Algerian Jews of Moroccan ancestry. Many of these Moroccan Jews, that is Moroccan of origin, who had resided in Algeria were naturalized by the Crémieux Decree, while others became French citizens by individual naturalization either before or after the decree. During Vichy, the French authorities and European settlers in Morocco were obsessed with how the abrogation of the Crémieux Decree affected French citizens of Moroccan origin and what that would mean in terms of the application of the statute for the Jews in Morocco. The discriminatory decrees issued in Morocco as royal decrees, dahirs, as all decrees were called, as was the case for, and this was the case for all legislation in Morocco. All legislation needed the signature of the Sultan. The decrees, the anti-Jewish decrees of Vichy, basically were replicated in Morocco and were applied to both Moroccan and non-Moroccan Jews. No differentiation was made between French Jewish citizens and foreign Jews in Morocco. There were, however, a few distinctions between Moroccan and non-Moroccan Jews. In the Dahir of October 1940, no non-Moroccan Jews residing in the protectorate were given the same racial definition as in France, which was basically every non-Moroccan with 3 grandparents of the Jewish race or 2 grandparents of the same race if his or her spouse is also Jewish. Well, Moroccan Jews continued to be defined by their religion. The Metropolitan Vichy administration opposed this distinction, but the local colonial authorities were able to prevail. There was a logic for maintaining this distinction in the protectorate, where if the Moroccan Jews were to be defined by race in the same category as non-Moroccans, then it would challenge their indigenous status and the colonial hierarchies upon which the protectorate system rested. In effect, the only Moroccans that the non-racial definition of Jews might apply to would be Muslim converts and their descendants, and this was a direct challenge to the Sultan Mohammed bin Yusuf, since in questioning his sovereignty, since it would question his sovereignty as Islamic ruler. This also was problematic for the French authorities, since the protectorate was also based on and legitimized by the preservation of the dynasty and its Islamic ruler with his Muslim and Jewish subjects. However, the 1941 Dahir that followed the Metropolitan Statute for the Jews, with the intensification of pressures from the Vichy government and the creation of the General Commissariat for Jewish Questions, eliminated this distinction between Moroccan and non-Moroccan Jews and applied the same racial definition to both. The Dahir of 1941 did make one important distinction between Moroccan and non-Moroccan Jews. Moroccans were permitted to continue practicing traditional artisanal activities in the retail trade, out of concern that banning Jews from these professions would destabilize the economy and thus undermine the strength of colonial rule. It might therefore be concluded that being an indigenous Moroccan subject to the Sultan would be advantageous to being a non-Moroccan Jew in Morocco. In Algeria, the abrogation of the Crémieux Decree implied that Jews would be regarded as indigenous and, in theory, assimilated to the indigenous Algerian Muslims. Yet in one important respect, the Jews were not simply reverting back to their 1870 status, as it might appear, and as it has often been described. The abrogation of the Crémieux Decree stipulated that French civil law regarding personal status would still apply to the Jews. Indeed, in the 1890s, the idea of removing citizenship and political rights while still applying French civil law had been part of the anti-Semitic campaign to abrogate the Crémieux Decree. In this sense, Jewish status after October 1940 remained distinct from indigenous Muslims whose status as indigenous subjects of France was based on retaining their personal law and on making the rejection of their Muslim personal status the criterion for individual naturalization as citizens. This legal distinction revealed by the abrogation of the Crémieux Decree was again to raise the question of racial hierarchies for Vichy, impelling them to simultaneously redefine the category of indigenous for both Muslims and Jews when the act that abrogated the Crémieux Decree was revised in February of 1942, which replaced the law of October 1940. In contrast, Jews in Morocco were already indigenous subjects like the Muslims, not of France, but of the Sultan, and both kept their personal status. In the Moroccan colonial hierarchy, this meant that native Jews even had a lower status than Muslims, a situation that the French colonial authorities preferred. Though no longer subject to discriminatory stipulations of dhimmi status, they did relinquish part of the judicial autonomy to the Mahzan courts. The Mahzan refers to the Moroccan state. And many regarded these as prejudicial. What the abrogation of the Crémieux Decree and redefinition of indigenous status in Algeria meant for the offspring of Moroccan immigrants naturalized in Algeria but resident in Morocco was a subject of debate and concern not only for the Jews but also for the colonial authorities and the anti-Semitic settlers. Would the loss of their French citizenship imply that they would become native subjects of France, for which there was no provision in the Moroccan protectorate? Or would they become Moroccan citizens and subjects to the Sultan, which would be one way that the Moroccan law could be interpreted? Significantly, the very origins of Moroccan citizenship were connected to problems arising from Jews obtaining foreign nationality abroad and returning to Morocco with newly acquired rights as foreign nationals. An article in the 1880 Madrid Convention, a meeting between the European powers in Morocco to curb the abuse of the system of consular protection, sought to limit the proliferation of Moroccans returning with foreign nationality. Moroccans naturalized abroad who returned to Morocco, quote, after a period of residence equal in time to that which was legally necessary to obtain naturalization, unquote, would again be subject to Moroccan law. While not intended as a nationality law, it did establish the principle of perpetual allegiance to the Sultan, which became the basis of the legal concept of citizenship during the Protectorate. And in fact, to this day, it remains the legal precedent by which the nationality of Jews of Moroccan descent is considered inalienable, even of those living in Israel. During the colonial period, it became the legal justification for excluding Jews from acquiring French citizenship and for maintaining the vast majority of Jews as indigenous subjects of the Sultan. In principle, then, French Jewish citizens of Moroccan descent in the Protectorate could be considered Moroccan, but it seems that most remained French citizens. The French had little interest in challenging this, since having a relatively small and controlled cadre of Jews in the colonial sector who could serve as intermediaries was in their interest. Even though from hindsight there were few benefits and a few disadvantages to French over Moroccan citizenship during Vichy rule, Algerian Jews in Morocco fought vigorously to preserve their French nationality. In the colonial hierarchy in Morocco, Jews with political rights as French citizens meant not only a status above Muslims, but also above indigenous Jews. Loss of citizenship was probably perceived as a worse situation than becoming indigenous. For in the long run, it could only have been believed that the anti-Semitic Vichy regime was ephemeral and that the principles of the French Republic would be restored. Some Jews succeeded in their petition to the Protectorate authorities to retain their French citizenship, arguing that their status as French citizens be recognized by virtue of the fact that they were Moroccans naturalized in Algeria subsequent to the Crimea Decree, implying that its abrogation in 1940 would not affect them. There were also about 1,300 Jews of Algeria who did not lose their citizenship when the Crimea Decree was abrogated in 1940, usually also because they had been naturalized individually after the Crimea Decree had been issued. This loophole was unsettling for the French authorities and jurists across North Africa. There are volumes of correspondence on this issue, on this loophole in the archives, incidentally. In Morocco, the European settlers put pressure on the Resident General's office, the Residency, to remedy the situation, concerned about the anomaly of Jews of Moroccan origin born in Algeria who had the same status as foreigners born in French territory, thus enjoying political rights as of French citizens. The numerous legal questions and problems created by the abrogation of the Crimea Decree across North Africa caused the Vichy authorities in Algeria to redefine indigenous as a racial category for both Muslims and Jews. The law of February 18, 1942, redefining the abrogation of the Crimea Decree, which I mentioned, and which replaced the law of 1940, was in some ways fairly similar, but there were differences between the two laws which are subtle but also very significant. The 1940 law refers to Jews of the departments of Algeria who would remain under French law, but this meant that the Mzabi Jews were not included, a point specifically discussed by Vichy jurists, since they were from the Saharan territories, which wasn't classified as a department in Algeria. This might not seem that relevant since the Mzabi Jews had not been beneficiaries of the Crimea Decree in the first place and were still classified as indigenous and thus not subject to French civil law as it pertained to personal status. But symbolically, the original exclusion and now inclusion of the Mzabi Jews was essential in Vichy's defining and racializing the category of indigenous. The revised law of February 1942 subtly changed the language to read the indigenous Jews of Algeria rather than the departments of Algeria, and that rather than referring to Jews remaining under the jurisdiction of French law, it simply refers to Jews ruled by French law, thus applying the law to all Jews. This created a new kind of French subject in which French personal status law applied without any political rights as citizens, precisely what anti-Semites had attempted but failed to legislate in the 1890s. The abrogation of the Crémieux Decree also raised questions about the indigenous status of Muslims. The law of 1942 was in conjunction with and preceded by a law that redefined and revamped the legal definition of nationality for Muslims, which was issued the previous day on February 17th. As in the case of the Jews, the authorities across North Africa were concerned about, as they saw it, the anomaly of indigenous French protégés, children of Tunisian and Moroccan immigrants, that is Muslims, in Algeria, who had become French and thus enjoyed a higher status than European foreigners. The law of February 17th transformed French citizens of Muslim origin into indigenous Muslim subjects, with the purpose of basically doing the same for Muslims what the Crémieux Decree's abrogation had done for the Jews. Likewise, in redefining the indigenous status of Jews, the law of February 18th stipulated that Moroccan or Tunisian Jews who acquired French nationality as a result of their birth or residence in Algeria were henceforth to be subject to the same status as Algerian Jews, effectively the removal of their French citizenship. These laws thus created a concept of subjects of the empire. The abrogation of the Crémieux Decree and the revised stipulations of 1942 actually gave Jews an inferior status to Muslims. The law pronounced that Jews could become naturalized French citizens through the Senatus Consult of 1865, the law that made Muslims and Jews French subjects governed by the personal law of their religions without allowance of becoming naturalized French citizens, with the allowance of them becoming naturalized French citizens if they would agree to give up their personal status to be governed by French civil law. But since the law that abrogated the Crémieux Decree both stripped the Jews of citizenship while maintaining, or applying in the case of the Mizrahi Jews, the jurisdiction of French civil law, did this mean effectively that Jews had no grounds for applying for naturalization? And for good measure, the law made it even more restrictive on Jews by making them ineligible for the Deinard law of 1919, the law that had created the idea of a kind of half-naturalized French citizen for Muslims who kept their personal status. In redefining the indigenous status in Algeria, which implicitly created imperial subjects, the Vichy authorities were clearly also looking to the racial hierarchies in Morocco. What the implications were for the many Jews from Algeria and Morocco, formerly French citizens, now indigenous subjects of France, is unclear. At the end of the day, during the Vichy period, it probably made little difference for the Jews' actual situation, since either as Jewish French citizens or indigenous subjects of France, they would still be subject to the same laws of exclusion that affected other Jews. In fact, only those French Jews who had been honored as decorated soldiers could retain or apply for citizenship and not be subject to the anti-Jewish laws. Of even greater concern for the French authorities across North Africa than the numerous legal complications and loopholes that emerged from annulling the Crémieux Decree was how its abrogation might affect the Muslim population. The French were so obsessed with the Crémieux Decree that many believed it united Muslims against colonial rule, not only in Algeria but also Morocco. With concern about the growth of anti-French nationalists in the 1930s, increasingly influenced by the Nazis, might not the abrogation of the Crémieux Decree win support of the Moroccan intelligentsia? For the Vichy government, the anti-Semitic laws were an opportunity to regain the initiative and to placate nationalists who were increasingly merging anti-French protest with anti-Semitism encouraged by the Nazis. Despite the German-Vichy alliance, the French were concerned about preserving the independence of their empire and containing Nazi influence in the colony. For this reason, the abrogation of the Crimea Decree might also serve the purpose of regaining Muslim support, or at least acquiescence to French rule. As a consequence, French officials in Algeria and Morocco investigated the reaction of the Muslim population to both the abrogation and the restitution of the Crimea Decree, reporting that the Muslims approved its repeal and were opposed in its reinstatement. Yet the reports submitted by police and French government officials in Algeria and Morocco appear well scripted, intended to confirm what the colonial authorities wanted to hear. If the abrogation of the Crimea Decree was discussed and approved of by many of the Muslim-educated elite, it was an illusion to think that by demoting the Jews' status, Muslim nationalists would relinquish their claims for greater political rights, which they had sought with increasing intensity since World War I. Furthermore, the nationalist leadership was well aware that the anti-Jewish laws would not be accompanied by expanding Muslim political rights. To the contrary, many understood that Vichy's anti-Semitic racial laws were designed to prevent Muslim advancement, since it undermined the notion that the indigenous population was entitled to citizenship. Overall, it is unlikely that the Crimea Decree's abrogation and its restitution elicited much response from the Moroccan Muslim population, and the survey only served to justify the actions taken by the colonial authorities. Although the anti-Jewish measures adopted by Vichy were a devastating blow for many Jews across North Africa, although in each country it was experienced somewhat differently, it was not the betrayal of France and Muslims that was foremost in the minds of most Jews, but the undermining of the hierarchy that had given Jews privileges or advantages, or in the case of Morocco and Tunisia, the aspiration for advancement within the colonial system. At the very moment that Muslim nationalist leaders were launching the independence movement that followed the end of Vichy in North Africa, the Jewish leadership sought to restore their status in the colonial system. The restitution of French citizenship to Algerian Jews seemed to ensure that Jews would forever maintain their privileged status in the colonial regime. The mass repatriation, as they called it, to the French mainland of Jews, along with the European settler population that came with independence, was the result. The same option did not exist for the vast majority of Moroccan Jews who remained indigenous subjects of the Sultan, Mohammed V, the good king who protected Jews during Vichy, which has become a part of the collective memory. The image of Mohammed ben Yusuf as protector of the Jews in defiance of Vichy was cultivated by the Sultan himself during World War II as a way to assert his independence from the colonial regime and to define himself as the national leader of Morocco. It was a subtle move, for the Sultan was well aware that the existence of the monarchy was still dependent on French colonial power. Yet he also understood that the edifice upon which the protectorate system was built also depended on maintaining the dynasty, and that gave him some leverage. The image of his opposition to the anti-Jewish laws gave him an opportunity to strengthen his position. While he continued to proclaim his unswerving loyalty to France, he used his symbolic capital to advance his status as Moroccan sovereign and protector of all his subjects, both Muslims and Jews. Ironically, it was also in the interest of the French resident general to maintain the image of the Sultan as protector of his Jewish subjects. The French resident general also considered Vichy's anti-Jewish laws as a challenge to the Sultan's sovereignty and counter to colonial interests in Morocco and its indigenous policy. Like the Sultan, the Residency feared that the application of at least some of the laws would be to the detriment of the economy and thus to the stability of its control of Morocco. As part of the Vichy regime, the protectorate authorities ostensibly supported the anti-Jewish laws at the same time that they devised ways to soften their implementation. The residency could also gain from the image of the Sultan working behind the scenes to protect the Jews, to deflect criticism of its half-hearted efforts to fully implement the economic measures demanded by the metropolitan Vichy authorities. The narrative of the Sultan's protection of the Jews was openly promoted by the French authorities after the Allied landings, anxious also to show that they themselves reluctantly applied the laws in an effort to distance itself from the Vichy regime. The confrontation over the Jewish question may also have given the Sultan a strategic advantage over some of the nationalists who were critical of the Sultan for too close a connection to the French authorities. The enhanced stature of the Sultan did not escape the attention of the Jewish leadership. With French citizenship still not an option for the masses of Moroccan Jews, as was the case in Algeria, Jewish leaders saw it in their best interest to support the sovereignty of the Sultan as a way to improve the position of the Jewish community as Moroccan subjects within the French Empire. There were a minority of Jews who supported the independence movement, but even in 1945, few Jews could have anticipated that French rule was to come to an end in the next decade or two, nor imagine a future in an independent Arab state. In view of the connection of some of the pan-Islamic Arab nationalists to the Nazis and the increasing centrality of the Zionist Arab conflict in Palestine to the pan-Arab cause, it is not at all surprising that the Jewish leadership sought to consolidate its status in the protectorate system. As the Committee of the Jewish Community of Fez wrote in a report that they sent to the World Jewish Congress in 1944, quote, "Under the aegis of the eternal France and the sovereignty of His Majesty Sidi Mohammed ben Yusuf, the chivalric and venerable Sultan of Morocco," unquote. In contrast to Algeria, Jewish life reconstituted itself in Morocco after independence, which came in 1956, despite the massive wave of emigration in the years preceding independence. An explanation for this Moroccan exceptionalism, in contrast to much of the Arab world, is that the colonial institutions, the military and political structures built by the French, remained. The French officials replaced by Moroccans, subordinate to the monarchy and its authoritarian rule. The Sultan's legendary protection of his Jewish subjects in defiance of Vichy became an important reason why Moroccan Jews imagined a future in Morocco when the French relinquished their control of the protectorate. Mohammed V's assertion as defender of the Jews during Vichy rule was a fundamental step in his transition from a figurehead sultan to a national leader, capable of appropriating the instruments of power. This is a point not lost to the monarchy, which continues to celebrate Mohammed V's role as protector of the Jews during World War II. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Daniel Schroeter, for your lecture. We have time to questions. If you want, you can take questions only in Hebrew, also in Hebrew. אוקיי, אפשר לשאול גם בעברית למי שרוצה. בבקשה, פרופסור עודד.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I seem to remember that Habib Bourguiba was anti-fascist. And I was wondering if there were other North African Muslim socialists, communists, or maybe even liberal nationalists who were also anti-fascists. And I never thought before about what their attitude was toward the Jews and anti-Semitism. But I was just wondering if Bourguiba was really so unique, or there were others like him, if I'm correct about Bourguiba. Maybe that's a legend too.
Yeah, no, there were definitely Muslims and even Muslims and Jews that sometimes joined forces against fascism. And this was true all across North Africa. Perhaps in Tunisia, perhaps more than elsewhere, but Algeria as well, Morocco as well. There were many communists, for example, and some of the leadership of communist parties sort of across North Africa were Jews. And then in Tunisia, of course, you also had more of some of the labor unions and syndicalists and so forth, who also took a position against fascism per se. So yes, that existed, and there were even efforts on the part of Liga, the league that was established against anti-Semitism, especially in Algeria, to reach out to Muslims to join forces against Nazi anti-Semitism. And indeed, there were some that joined, and that's kind of some of the entente that existed in the 30s kind of failed in the long run, kind of fizzled out, when you got into the war years. But there were certainly there were some engaged in the anti-fascist movement. But that was not the mainstream, I would say, of the nationalists in Morocco or Algeria, for that matter. No.
Okay, thank you.
שלום, אני אשאל בעברית. רציתי לשאול באיזו מידה, אוקיי. באיזו מידה החוקים שנחקקו במרוקו לגבי הרבעים האירופאים נגד היהודים, באיזו מידה הם יושמו, ובאיזו מידה היהודים נאלצו להיקלע בתוך אותם מלאכים שהם עברו אליהם, במידה והם אכן עברו אליהם.
So actually, yeah, in fact, it was rather limited. The one place that it happened, and even there, not to the full extent, was in Fez. And probably there were some people who were forced out of their homes and had to move to the Melach in Meknes. In Casablanca, it became totally impractical, and the authorities, neither the French authorities nor of course, the Jews had any interest in really pursuing it. And other cities as well, it just simply was not implemented, as far as I know. Now, there could be some information that I haven't been able to uncover, but I've seen no evidence of it outside of Fez and some reference to it in Meknes.
תודה רבה. כן, שי, בבקשה.
Thank you very much. From your talk, the image of Jews in these countries is not altogether flattering. They seem rather elitistic and sort of clinging to the privileged status vis-a-vis the natives, and in general sort of declining even the prospect of being citizens in an Arab independent countries and so on. And I just wondered how general was this as an attitude? Were there exceptions of Jewish intellectual, Jewish activists who were more sympathetic to the Arab nationalist cause, or if you could say something about that?
Yeah, I was probably referring most of all to the leadership being, more, feeling as sort of their responsibility to, you could say, maintain their status quo, or return to the status quo, of course, after the war. But it also challenged, the one aspect I didn't get to is it challenged somewhat, I think, the internally Jewish structure as well, so that there were lots of different movements taking place. And so what I can speak mostly about Morocco, because in France, because in Algeria, they were already French citizens. That was a whole different story. But in Morocco, there were significant numbers of Jews who did reach out, and there was certain kind of entente in the years prior to independence of Jews who, if not becoming members of the Istiklal party as such, we're in conversation about their future as citizens of an independent state. It was, again, mainly among the intelligentsia. I would say the mass of Moroccan Jews were poor, were very impoverished, had very little engagement with politics whatsoever, so that they were, in a sense, under the sway of the community leadership, but simply didn't engage in politics. So I think that, and that was really the case for most Moroccan Muslims as well, right? So you're talking about really those, and you can base what you can base, basically you can base what I say on people who are writing and political movements which didn't involve the majority of the population. But yes, there was definitely an intelligentsia that was engaged in in the nationalist movement. And that was true, of course, and you would know more about Tunisia and elsewhere, but yes. And there were some Jews who supported the FLN in Algeria, and some recent research has been done on that question. It wasn't an insignificant number either, but again, it was a small minority of some of the intelligentsia.
Okay, one more question, please.
Minnesota Nights. Question.
Minnesota Nights. I'm not a Minnesota native, actually. So.
To Minnesota, not nice.
Okay.
Is that better this way? No. The Vichy regime, how much power or lack of power, how much influence the Vichy power created to promote anti-Semitism or not to promote anti-Semitism, citizenship, no citizenship, and the interactions between Algeria, Tunisia, etc., etc. It seems to me that the Vichy regime had a lot to do with it, to bring it up. Is it so? This is my question.
Yeah, I mean, the Vichy regime, it was different in each country, of course, because Algeria was was considered integral to metropolitan France. It was sort of, the laws, in a sense, were kind of direct, even though they implemented specific things to the colony as well. But yes, I mean, they certainly, I would say, much more than in the case of, and I should add that Algeria was the center, you could say, of Vichy power in North Africa. So there it was much, they did much more in promoting anti-Semitism than was the case in Morocco, where the resident general who became, you could say by default, the Vichy regime and representing the Vichy regime in Morocco was not so keen on the sort of national revolution of Vichy and some of the worst excesses of racial anti-Semitism. You could say he was kind of like an anti-Semite of the old school. But he was under a lot of pressure and criticism, both from the central Vichy authorities in Algeria and by the very large and vociferously anti-Semitic legionnaires who were basically an arm of Vichy fascism in North Africa. So you could say there were not only the government, but there were also other groups among the settler population who were promoting anti-Semitism among the population. Also tried to rile up the Muslim population, although usually with limited success in that period.
Okay, thank you very much. תודה רבה לפרופסור שרויטר.